You know, sometimes God works in more mysterious ways than we really understand. Little did I think that when I left California that I would be speaking to you this morning and to have at my right hand, but literally one of God's great saints in the person of Starr Daily. And when I say that Starr is behind me, I mean it. Since Geraldine left this week and the speaking load was quite heavy for the remainder of the week, the council ring asked me to share with you something of my thinking this morning. And so I've been dwelling quite a while on just exactly what I could share with you from out of my own experience with Christ. And I've been led to share a couple of little tales and then draw from this some universal truth that all of you might enjoy. I have a confession to make. You see, I happen to like, besides loving the Lord, I happen to enjoy good theater. I suppose that in the pocket of practically every suit that I own, unless my wife has gotten to it recently, there are the ticket stubs from some play or musical that we've seen in the last few years. We've accumulated quite a long list of our favorites. Mind you, I'm interested in good theater because I think there's oftentimes a message that comes in good plays. And I'm interested in all forms of theater, from puppets to opera, including Shakespeare and drama. We've seen such a wide variety, for example, as Shakespeare's plays As You Like It up in Connecticut at Stratford, at a time when I calculated one time it cost us $25 a seat by the time we paid for all the expenses of going and coming back, although we called it a family weekend, you know, a camping trip to Connecticut that included a night at the theater. We've seen Twelfth Night and Much Ado About Nothing. We've seen Hamlet, The Merchant of Venice, The Taming of the Shrew. On Broadway we saw The Unsinkable Molly Brown. We saw Zero Mostel and Eli Wallach in that crazy play entitled Rhinoceros, which deals with a very significant social issue, the matter of conforming to the way other people behave, the way society says you ought to behave. We've seen the delightful and charming and devoted Ethel Waters at the Pasadena Playhouse in Member of the Wedding, in the role that she created on the Broadway stage. I remember a good many years ago I saw in Chicago Hugh Marlowe and K.T. Stevens in the voice of the Turtle when I was only 17. And my love of the theater has extended all the way down to the very present. Incidentally, we saw Hugh Marlowe not so long ago on the stage of the Pasadena Playhouse in a play entitled The King of Hearts. And an interesting thing happened. One of the supporting players, a man by the name of Tom Hatton, who plays on local television a character which is roughly resembling Popeye the Sailor Man, one of these children's programs, a bit of whimsy and nonsense. We saw Tom Hatton steal the play from Hugh Marlowe, the master actor. Now, I'm not sure what was, I suppose it may have been a little bit like a friend of mine who went to England. In anticipation, he had planned to go to hear the Archbishop of Canterbury preach. And this man of God went to the cathedral and heard him, and then came back, and all of his friends said, "Well, what'd you think of the Archbishop?" And my friend, who wouldn't say a mean word, I think, even about the devil himself, said, "Well, everybody's entitled to an off day." Well, maybe it was Hugh Marlowe's off night that we were there, but Tom Hatton stole the play from Hugh Marlowe. Now, what's the point in all of this? Well, let's put a little parentheses about the introduction of this talk, and I'd like to tell you a story, and then we'll connect them up. Not so many years ago, I stood in a very active and prosperous-looking furniture factory beside a man who was earning only 4 cents per hour. Oh, to be sure, he had some other fringe benefits. He had medical care. He had vocational training. He had 3 good meals a day. Well, at least ample, if not good. He had a private, well, he didn't have a private room. He shared it with another man. He had 24-hour protective service because, you see, the one thing he didn't have was his freedom. Because this man was a prisoner in a medium-security prison in Ohio, and he was there by virtue of having violated some of society's laws. Yes, he earned 4 cents an hour. 2 cents of it went into a fund that he could spend at the prison store, and 2 cents of it went into what I suppose you might call a kind of a pension fund or retirement fund for when he left. Now, I suppose if you were in prison long enough that at 2 cents an hour, this might add up to a considerable sum of money. But the point is, he didn't have his freedom. Now, I think the 2 stories, the stories of Tom Hatton in The King of Hearts and the man at the medium security prison, have one thing in common. Let's put a parenthesis around this story and come back to it in a moment. There was a great Russian dramatist by the name of Konstantin Stanislavski. He's the father of the method acting, the method school of acting that Marlon Brando is so famous for, where you have to feel like you're a tree in order to be a tree. You know, this kind of method acting. But Stanislavski wrote a very famous and very true statement one time. In an essay on acting, he said, "There are no small parts in a play. There are only small actors." And I thought to myself, my goodness, this sounds to me like a Christian teaching. Because isn't this what the New Testament tells us? That a man, regardless of the size of his talent, is expected to perform to the best of his ability? In just a moment, we'll take a look at the story of the talents and see if the main issue here isn't the matter of the way in which we perform, the role that is assigned to us. Starr pointed out the other night that left to his own devices, man can vote to be evil. If I remember his quotation exactly, he said that the devil votes against good and God votes for it, and our vote carries the election. In its natural state, man tends to have this freedom of choice, and he may choose to be sinful, because without Christ, he will be sinful. But you see, the redeemed man, the one who has accepted Christ and is redeemed, chooses the role voluntarily, chooses to be on the side of God. He chooses to be a son of God. God has chosen him, yes, but he has claimed this relationship for his own. And I believe with all my heart that we can choose the kind of a role we're going to play in life. And how well we perform that role becomes very, very important. Let's go back and pick up Tom Hatton. I think the reason that Tom Hatton stole the show from Hugh Marlowe was because that Hugh Marlowe was at the top of the heap, and he was doing the Pasadena Playhouse a favor, being a name star, and who knows what other kinds of pressures were on his personal life. And to him it was another routine week, but not so for Tom Hatton. This was Tom Hatton's big opportunity to appear in a play on the same stage with a star. And Tom Hatton did his job so well that he sparkled like a gem on the ocean, on the seashore. Just sparkled because he did his job so well. You've all seen plays or movies in which one character actor just stole the whole scene. It makes the stars a bit chagrined to think that this happens, but it does. Stanislavski, you see, said this, that the important thing is not the size of the part, but how well you perform. Now, Jesus said this. He told them constantly that their responsibility was to live to the utmost. He was forever holding up to them the concept of greatness in obscure situations. For example, when he tells the story of the Last Judgment, he reverses worldly standards on the basis of blindness to everyday opportunities for service to God. He tells us that in God's sight, the smallest kindness performed by the humblest person is as great as if it were being done for the Lord Himself. How often hasn't it happened in CFO camps? When someone comes and says to you, "I've been watching you, I've been listening, and the Lord spoke to me through you." 3 or 4 people have stopped me this morning and have said, "My, what a wonderful job you did with the young people this morning." I have a confession to make. The worldly representative of the Lord in that project was my wife, not me. But if you got something from the worship this morning, the Lord spoke through the youth. And how often isn't it that a child, or the least among us, says the word, the phrase, the thought that really touches the spark in our life, and a whole bonfire results? Well, let's think about this for a little while. Let's see some of the implications of this kind of thinking. Let me say, first of all, that sometimes the big parts, the big roles that we look at in our society, sometimes these are disappointments when you get to look at them closer. Sometimes you think, "Oh, how I'd like to be the president of this company." Have you ever talked to the presidents of some of these big companies? That job isn't near as easy as it looks when you're out there in the plant. Boy, I'd tell the boss how to run it. If I was only the boss, I could run this shop a lot better and a lot more efficiently and make a lot more money. It's easy when you're out in the shop to think that the position at the top of the heap is really going to be super. But until you've sat in that seat, you don't really know. My experience with people who are at the top is somewhat limited. I don't have many millionaire friends in my association. I don't know many corporation presidents. I know a few. But my observation is that it's a very lonely existence. Let me give you one illustration. One of my very, very dear friends who lives in Laverne, as some of you know, happens to be Bob Richards, Mr. Wheaties, the Olympic pole vaulting parson. Bob Wheaties would almost be a good name for him. Bob Richards. I've learned to know Bob Richards over the last 2 or 3 years very well. And I've discovered something, I don't think he'd mind if I tell you, that sometimes being at the top can be a very lonely existence. Bob is a hero, in quotation marks. He's a champion, a true champion. Pole vaulted more times over 15 feet than any man alive, even now. And of course, he has said repeatedly that the kind of thing they do now is not pole vaulting, it's riding an elastic or fiberglass spring, and it's an entirely different sport than it used to be when you had a rigid pole. Remember, he pole vaulted in the day when a rigid pole was the kind of pole you used. Now they use a flexible one that bends almost half over, and it throws you with a spring. And you have to learn how to ride that spring. That's where the skill is involved. But here's a man who was 3 times Olympic champion, twice the decathlon winner in America, who even now yet, at the age of nearly 40, is one of the most athletic men I've ever met. One of the men whose speaking engagements would almost run most of us ragged. He belongs to this million-mile club that the airlines have because he's flown so many miles. He speaks one night in New York, another night in Miami, another night in Minneapolis, another night in Chicago, and he comes home for the weekend. And it goes on like this day after day after day. But I'm here to testify that when I go over to his studio in our little town of Laverne, I sit down and we talk as friend to friend. And Bob Richards is a lonely man. Because, you see, being at the top has its price. And it isn't all glory. There is glory at the top, yes. But what I'm saying is, don't be too sure that the big parts are as desirable as they seem. This man has no private life to speak of. Every place he goes, people want an autograph or some word to their child, or some word of advice. When he comes home, he has people come to see him. They want to borrow money. They want to borrow a camera. They want to borrow a truck. They want to borrow things. Very few people in this situation understand the price that he has to pay. So what I'm saying is that being at the top isn't all peaches and cream. There's a responsibility, to be sure. And the real task is how well you do your job, no matter what level you may be called upon to live. Now, a second thing I'd like to say about this whole idea is the fact that sometimes the big parts in life, the parts that we think are really big, are sometimes played by some pretty small actors. Now, it's not true in the case of Bob Richards. He's a big man. He's doing a good job. But there are many times when you get to know somebody at the top that you find out they got feet of clay. Not all the big jobs in the world are filled by big men. All you need to do is pick up the newspaper and read about some of the fiascos that we get ourselves into in state and local governments and even in the national scene once in a while. Some politicians have the uncanny ability that every time they open their mouth, they not only put one foot in, they put both feet in. And part of this is due to the fact that some of the people who are elevated to the top are really small actors. Well, now, if this were all the considerations, we wouldn't have very much to say about this, would we? But there's a third point that is very important. And it's this, that very often we can discover that in the little parts there are some very big implications. Now, think back over your own life. How many times has your life been changed by what seemed at the time to be a very small happening? The most personal illustration I can think of is the time I had a choice between going to a weekend camp of interdenominational youth and a basketball tournament in our home county. And I was torn. I liked basketball when I was in high school. And I wavered back and forth. It could just as easily have gone to the tournament as to the camp. But for whatever reasons, I was led to choose, or did choose, of my own volition. I can't really recall how I made the decision. I went to that weekend camp. And you know what happened? You can guess. That was the weekend I met Florence. Now, that was a pretty little beginning. There were no hearts and flowers being played. There was no trumpet sounding saying, this is the woman that's going to be your wife. There was instead a little crazy ditty that has somehow stuck with us all these years. I remember we were doing dishes of all things, washing dishes, and I was wiping while she was washing, and we got to singing a crazy song that was popular in those days, and here I really date myself. 10 little soldiers on a 10-day leave. Oh, that's an old one. If you don't know that one, you're really out of it. And to this day, every time I hear this song, and I've learned to play it on the piano, it's one of 3 songs I play on the piano, because it has meaning for us. Now, there's nothing spiritual about it, believe me. They were all chasing the colonel's daughter, Genevieve. And you remember the song, don't you? When they got there, they found out that